Considering that Games Workshop posts 15-minute unedited videos of two guys ranting at a camera to officially publish changes to the game, this video might as well be an official announcement of 11th edition. Warhammer Tabletop is a game that I've been enjoying a lot recently, but it's inevitable a game this old, with this many rules, and with this many different models is going to have some issues. My biggest problems with the system are surprisingly a little bit more core than just a few balancing issues, though. Much like lots of hyper-competitive games, any silly, potentially unbalanced elements have been thoroughly rubbed off the rule set with an industrial sander. Usually, I'm actually all for this. Games tend to be at their best when they're as fair as possible, but war games are unique in that they offer a very novel narrative experience that isn't really supported by this hyper-focus on competitive viability. I really wanted to dig in with what I disagreed with from the base rules, my problems with how they're written and handled, and the approach I took to fixing it by finding out how to reward and incentivize narrative play. I want to acknowledge up front that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for any game. These are changes designed specifically for me, to make the game more enjoyable for me, specifically. I can give my reasons for why I don't think Warhammer or war games in general make very good competitive games, but you are perfectly free to disagree with my conclusions and solutions. I suppose this project needs a name, and I was originally going to go with War Story, because it's about narrative, but for certain reasons, which I'll get into later, it's probably going to be TitanHammer. I may or may not have not been able to help myself and made a full homebrew IMC codex. With that out of the way, this project has actually ballooned way past my expectations to the point that I'm going to have to make it a two-parter, probably three, which is entertainingly enough just what happened with my Helldivers videos. These 4 videos, all originally meant to be one. Here in this first video, I'd like to cover the game's original mechanics, which I've changed, then in the next one I'll talk about the wholly new stuff that I've added on top, with a little Titanfall-flavored surprise in there. All of this stuff has gone through a lot of revisions through playtesting, which is something that I don't think is showcased a lot online very much. It's really important to remember that all the stuff shown here in this video and subsequent videos has been concluded on after many matches. Lots of games of the default vanilla experience and my homebrew one are what shape the rules that we play with for the games going forward. These aren't ideas that I had in a vacuum when I putting into a video because it sounds cool. They've all been tested pretty thoroughly in actual games. Some of those new mechanics, like random events, may seem significantly more exciting than numerical-focused rule changes, but they're arguably even more important. It's always enticingly easy to get overly focused on the most exciting additions, but you have to fix the foundations of a building if you want the thing to stand. I made a lot of changes, which you can see in this gigantic Google Doc, so I'm just going to go cover the ones that I find to be the most impactful. Warhammer, being a war game, is about combined arms. Aircraft, vehicles, infantry, and support units all in the same battle with interlocking systems and dynamics. Infantry is always my favorite focus. The boots on the ground aspect, the image of people scouring through ruined buildings, and the teamwork. I love it. Evidently, so does Warhammer, as its biggest poster boys are always infantry. Now, I hate to say it, but they are implemented into this combined arms dynamic horribly. While a tank can have half a dozen weapons, infantry just have a gun. Their small arms are so comedically bad at wounding vehicles, which is fine, that is pretty realistic after all, but this is usually supplemented by infantry having good anti-tank. In Wargame Red Dragon, literally every infantry unit has AT, for example, and I get to make this comparison because it has Wargame in the name, but in Warhammer, infantry's anti-tank is usually both so bad and in such low numbers that they are realistically only able to engage other infantry. Typically, 1 to 2 lads in a full squad will have a heavy weapon, which can range from something as useless as a flamer to something more universally applicable like a plasma gun. These are squads of 10. 10 to 20% of the squad has a weapon worth considering, and the rest might as well all have Nerf guns. This gives battles this really lopsided aspect to them for what's supposed to be combined arms in an outrageous setting. Infantry end up fighting infantry, vehicles though can fight whatever they want, which is usually other vehicles because they're the only things that can realistically damage each other. This is especially bad with the Imperial Guard. Just for fun, I ran a game between a friend and I where he got a 6,000 point IG army versus a 3k army. He lost. Hard. So hard, in fact, he never crossed the center line of the battlefield. Infantry is so absurdly weak at penetrating armor that even with 2 times more models than you're meant to have, his entire 6,000 point army got stopped in its tracks by 3 200 point Yavaras. Coincidentally, this is the match that made me stop playing Tau after realizing their entire faction premise is way too good, and there's no way to not make them astronomically better than everyone else. The reason small arms are so bad is due to the kind of insane rules for wounding, which means that I have to get technical about rules and about numbers. All you need to know is about 3 relevant stats, which are toughness, strength, and what you have to roll on a d6 to actually hit the target, called weapon skill. To showcase the absolute worst case scenario, let's take a guardsman and his lasgun. The lasgun has a strength of 3, and it hits targets on 4s or above, and that's half the dice on a d6, so it hits half the time. You can probably gather this yourself, but that means that it's awful. After you hit, assuming you hit, you roll to actually wound the target, essentially checking if the attack actually pierced armor or hit somewhere critical. You check the weapon's strength versus the target's toughness, so let's say a Scout Sentinel, which is a 60 cost walker intended as a screening tool for the rest of the force. Their toughness is 7, well over double the lasgun's measly strength of 3, so you wound on a 6. Even if you do manage to roll that, the Sentinel has a save of 3 or more, so even if you do pass the 1 in 6 chance to wound, we have another 1 in 3 chance for it to actually do anything. If they decide to spend 5 more points to make it an armored Sentinel, that save becomes 2, and so that 1 in 3 chance becomes a 1 in 6, and I shouldn't need to tell you how awful those odds are. This isn't an isolated cherry-picked case either. Vehicles having a save of 2 is extremely common because you're meant to shoot them with weapons that are armor-piercing, which makes their save worse, and even then the odds are still a crapshoot. In effect, weapons which don't have any AP are completely fucking useless against anything bigger than a Gretchen, because that's most infantry weapons in the game, even the goddamn bolter, which, for reference, let me quickly demonstrate how this gun is depicted in Dark Tide. These weapons being so bad means that infantry don't get to interact with vehicles whatsoever. Even against vehicles and infantry with a save of 3, that's still a solid 60% chance for any success to turn into a failure. By default, infantry seem to be balanced to stand on control points and literally nothing else. This might seem like a weird thing to complain about at length in a video which is ostensibly about narrative play, but you have to understand how much this dampens any interesting narrative that could occur with infantry. They see a giant vehicle, instead of there being a glimmer of hope that they could take it out, they're just fucked. Both players know this, and when a tank shoots at infantry, they might as well save themselves the time of rolling and just take all the infantry models off the board. If they could instead actually have a chance to take down the vehicle, even if it's unlikely, that is far more engaging than just being turbo fucked. I would love to cut saves completely so each attack has one less roll associated with it, but doing so would be pretty disastrous for the balance due to how much it relies on it, and how it would make the alpha striking issues the game already has even worse. Whoever goes first is at such a tremendous advantage, especially in some matchups, it genuinely feels like there's some mechanics missing which are supposed to be in place to help the second player. This is understandable to a degree. The first person to strike in war is obviously going to have an advantage, but who gets to do so is entirely decided by a dice roll, so it's not anything skill-based. Because all of one's player's turn is done at once, a la XCOM, it means that the one who gets to act first will often obliterate a good chunk of the enemy's force before they can do anything. If the game used a system more similar to bolt action, where both sides more often alternate actions, this would be minimized, but as is, if you go first, you are at an enormous advantage. So, the solution I decided on was to rework the core of the problem rather than trying to supply band-aid fixes, change the wounding rules, and have another look at saves. This graphic shows how the rule works by default. Your chance to wound changes when your strength is double, higher, equal, lower, and half of the toughness of the target. I just cut this step right here. So if your strength is equal or lower, you still wound on 4s, wounding on 5s if you're half the target's toughness. This makes it way less of a crapshoot, as it goes from 1 in 6 to a 1 in 3 at the very worst. On top of this, default saves of 2+ have become 3+. To pat myself on the back a little bit, this feels surprisingly great without feeling overpowered. The chance to wound with garbage weapons was so bad in vanilla that my friend and I found ourselves consistently not even bothering to attack with some weapons because it's nothing except a waste of time. The chance each dice has to do something is so abysmal that just why bother? With these changes, it's much likelier, but not likely enough to feel broken. For example, a full squad of boys managing to do some 2 damage to a rhino. It's not a lot, but it feels far better than chucking 30 attacks at a problem only to get nothing out of it than wasting a few minutes. Considering that you're supposed to do every dice one by one if you're an actual insane person, I can't imagine how much worse this must feel on the actual tabletop, where to resolve one attack, an orc player literally rolls dice for 20 minutes. For no reason. I also found these changes fit quite well narratively. Getting chased down by 20 Kroot was no longer, funny, it was horrifying as I was promptly eaten alive, power armor or not. I made a lot of minute stat changes to go along with this one. Strength matters much less now because the wounding rules are significantly less swingy than previously, which I think is a good thing. Most things wound on 4s, and I like that, especially when saves mean most of them still fail anyway. To give the game a focus on narrative, I had to do a little bit more than just tweak damage numbers. In the default game, you just arbitrarily start with 10 more victory points if your army is painted. It's a game mechanics reward for slaving away at painting miniatures. But what if there was a game mechanics reward for narrative play? So if an infantry sergeant or a character has a unique, fitting name at the start of the battle, they get an extra wound. Universally, for everyone. Except epic heroes, though. They already get names, and they're boring, so I never use them. People get attached really easily. You can throw googly eyes on pretty much anything to get people immediately attached to them, and so adding on a name makes losing them feel so much worse. Speaking from experience, you will make inoptimal plays and play far more dynamically if you're worried about your favorite dude dying. Someone who you should care about losing, but don't, is your warlord, the army leader. Warlords are really irrelevant in 10th edition. You specifically choose who the leader of your force is, and there is maybe one mechanic attached to it in the entire rule set. That is completely changed now. Warlords always get a free stratagem every turn, they get fights first if they're melee oriented, and they always succeed at a little new mechanic called Men of the Hour. This makes your warlord an actual valuable asset who you're incentivized to push forward rather than just some guy that doesn't actually mean anything. About that new mechanic. The default rules are so devoid of anything incentivizing interesting narratives that I pretty much had to include a few more mechanics to help encourage narrative play. Heavily inspired by Rome Total War's Men of the Hour mechanic, I wanted something that could make even the lowliest soldier stand out from the crowd. This mechanic has gone through a lot of different drafts because it was really hard to get right. Intrinsically, it has to be something random and unpredictable, but when it goes off, it should be exciting for everyone rather than annoying or exceedingly bullshit. I originally had this mechanic trigger exclusively on kill, and it made your entire infantry squad come back as well as giving huge buffs. This felt like horse shit to be on the receiving end of, and it was a pain to keep track of. The second draft triggered on either kills or being reduced to a quarter strength. It gave buffs to either killing power or survivability depending on which one was more relevant to what was happening. If you were killing, you kill better, and if you were dying, die less. This was much, much better, but still had a few notable flaws. Namely that the latter trigger, being reduced to a quarter strength, could only ever proc on a unit once. This left scenarios where there'd be one guy heroically holding off 5 for turn after turn, but wasn't a Man of the Hour. The current third draft is something I'm very happy with. As well as rolling for it when infantry is reduced to half strength, you also roll for it if you succeed a battle shock test. Though only one's in the command phase, so factions that rely on these tests in combat don't get shafted. This takes a mechanic that felt completely irrelevant in vanilla and turns it into something that's exciting rather than a chore. Compared to previous iterations, it's also transformed into a comeback mechanics rather than a snowball win more mechanic, which feels so much less awful to be on the receiving end of. If they succeed, they get a D3 of models back, heal any lost wounds, get a 4+ invuln save, and it lets them shoot or charge the nearest enemy. This makes the effects of it feel immediate, it isn't really hard to keep track of, and it transforms a really boring mechanic into a really exciting one. Writing off some lone guy only for him to embrace his courage and charge forward with a few men you thought were dead is really memorable, and the actual chance he'll have a serious impact on the battle is not super high, so it doesn't really feel like bullshit. There were many more mechanics that I added on top of this which will fit better into its own part. As I said, this project ballooned a lot, and there was so much about the base game that I had to change to get it all to work. When I made Lancerfall last year, which is a project in a similar vein to this one, a lot of people seemed to think it was a bunch of ideas that I had in a vacuum, but those were changes that I playtested and concluded on after playing a vanilla Lancer campaign for 6 months. Similarly, I've been playing Warhammer Tabletop for a long time now, and these were the changes I made after and during all that experience to make it more engaging. This disclaimer is in here as a long-winded way to say, I know at least a little bit about what I'm talking about. These are far from all of the changes though. I've still got to talk about the entirely new evac mechanics, random events, and maybe, just maybe, that entirely playable IMC codex. I kinda couldn't help myself. Here, I'll let you in a little sneak peek. Here's their roster at the time of writing. And here's a bonus teaser of a little model render. You might recognize them. If you want to see anything added, you know, just go let me know in those comments down there that YouTube loves so much.